All right, we'll go ahead and get started again. Like I said earlier, my name is Leanne Foster, and I am a provider outreach and education specialist here at WPS Government Administrators. And I want to thank you all again for joining us today for our webinar on provider enrollment for diagnostic testing facilities, also referred to as IDTFs. We'll start with our disclaimer. So the material presented today, along with answers to questions asked today, are being answered and provided based on current Medicare rules and regulations. If you are familiar with Medicare at all, you know that Medicare rules and regulations do change often. So we encourage you to make sure that you continue to monitor official CMS communications, and that includes the CMS and the WPS-GHA website, just to make sure that you are staying current with the most up-to-date CMS rules and regulations. Now, I also mentioned questions. I will be taking questions today through the chat feature. Aline is helping me monitor those, and I do encourage questions. So please feel free to throw those in the chat on any of the material for today. We will answer those as time allows. If for some reason there are more questions than time allows, we will be creating a follow-up document to make sure that we get all of your questions answered so that you have that. And finally, I just need to make you aware that CMS does prohibit photographing, screenshotting, or recording of this education. As I indicated moments ago, we are recording this, so there's simply no need. You will have access to this session once that recording becomes available. So again, with that recording, what we're going to do with that is we are going to post that to our YouTube channel as an encore presentation. And that's going to allow you to take a look at it again if you wanted to see something again, if there's something you missed, or if you think that there's someone who was not able to attend today that might find this useful, you can certainly share that. WPS also recognizes that not everybody can get into YouTube due to security restrictions that we all deal with on a daily basis as we do our job. So the other thing that we have is on our training center page, we do have a link to our encore videos. They will look like a YouTube video, but we do have a player embedded into our website, so you will be able to see the recordings without actually having to access YouTube. And they'll be available there for approximately 90 days. And again, that recording is going to be made available as soon as possible after this session, barring any technical issues with the recording that prohibit us from posting that. Not that we anticipate those, though. That brings me to our agenda for today. So as I mentioned, today we are talking about provider enrollment for independent diagnostic testing facilities, also referred to as IDTFs. And we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the eligibility requirements for IDTFs. They have a list of standards that we want to go through. It's a fairly lengthy list, and we want to break that down for you a little bit. We're going to talk about how to properly complete the provider enrollment application, which is the CMS 855B, and we'll talk a little bit about both electronic and paper applications. They are completed similarly, but their interface is different, so we'll talk through that. We're going to talk about the documentation that's required for IDTFs, and this will include any documentation or any information that's needed regarding any supervising or interpreting physicians or technicians that you have. And we won't just be covering initial enrollments. We will also be mentioning some tips for changes and revalidations when the time comes for that. So a lot of that's going to be the same, but we're going to call out where there might be some of those challenges when you're filling that information out. I am including a list of acronyms. There are some acronyms that I will be using today. So that list is going to be in one of the first pages of the presentation that you have today, so that you have that information as we go through, just to make things a little bit easier. But I want to start with the definition of an IDTF. So CMS's definition of an IDTF is a facility that performs diagnostic tests independently from a hospital or physician's office. That that independence is the key piece. So an IDTF is not going to be part of a larger facility. They may have parent organizations and things of that nature, but they are essentially a freestanding facility that is performing those diagnostic tests. As I mentioned, and we'll go through these a little bit more, they do have to meet the standards that are laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, 410.33. And we are going to talk about those a little bit more, but I've also included a link in your resources today, so you'll have that if you want to take a look at what those standards are. Like I said, again, they're providing diagnostic tests. So an IDTF is typically going to have direct interaction with the patient during testing. They're performing a CT scan, they're performing an MRI, things of that nature where the patient comes in for that testing. And you will hear and see in CMS documentation that referred to as a direct IDTF. And really that's all that means, is that a direct IDTF is physically going to have the patient involved in the testing at the time of the testing. What we've seen, not even just since the pandemic, but what we've seen in recent years for a multitude of reasons is that IDTF facilities have developed some different strategies. They've innovated on how they are utilizing technology to perform diagnostic tests. And sometimes it doesn't require an interaction with the beneficiary. An example of that could be perhaps a 24-hour monitoring situation for something cardiac. Maybe it's monitoring of a pacemaker for diagnostic purposes. That's just an example of where there's actually testing going on, but the patient's not necessarily physically present for that testing. Those are, if they're not having any direct contact with the patient, that is an indirect IDTF. They typically have to meet the same regulations and the standards that are laid out, but I just want to make you aware you're going to see that verbiage when you're looking at CMS documentation, but ultimately the requirements are going to be the same for enrollment in services. IDTFs can be fixed or mobile. If they're fixed, they're going to have a physical location where patients are coming to have those services. They're coming to the equipment, they're coming to the physicians and the technicians that are going to be performing those tests. But you've probably all seen the trucks going up and down the road that have MRI scanner on the side of the trailer. That would be an example of a mobile IDTF, where that piece of equipment is going to the patient, wherever they happen to be. That technically still qualifies as an IDTF. They're independent of the facilities that there may be, the locations that they're going to, but they themselves are still independent. We'll talk about that just a little bit. There are sections on the CMS 855 application that are used to report that information. So we'll talk about that. With IDTFs, the staff typically include physicians, so that can be supervising or interpreting physicians. And we'll talk about the details of those, but supervising, they're overseeing the tests, they're overseeing the facility, and there's different levels of that supervision. Interpreting physicians, that's going to be someone who's reading that test. They're interpreting those results. They're not necessarily required, so they're not necessarily going to be part of every IDTF, but they could be, and we'll talk about their reporting. Then you're also going to see the technicians, and these would be non-physician staff that are taking the tests. They're running the equipment. They're part of calibrating that equipment. So they are those technicians that are going to be facilitating those tests, the mechanical pieces of that. So services, examples of services, we've talked about a few of these, but the services that IDTFs provide are always going to be services that are based on a referral. So they are accepting patients where a service that they provide, a diagnostic service they provide, has been ordered by the treating physician, the physician that's actually treating and managing the care for the patient. So some examples would include just general diagnostic radiology services, MRIs, CT scans, mammography, and even sleep studies. So these are the kinds of tests that we see. They're not going to be billing for therapeutic only services, though. There needs to be that diagnostic component because that is the primary function of what they're doing. That brings me to the standards that they have to meet in order to be set up. So first, they do have to comply with all state and federal licensure. And as we go through this, I mentioned before that the performance standards are laid out in the CFR 410.33, which you do have a link to. They are also laid out in our program integrity manual. We'll refer to that as the PIM. And IDTF standards and enrollment requirements are laid out in Chapter 10, sections 10.2.2.4. And I've also included a link to that in your resources section today so that you have that if you want to look at these in a little bit more detail. I'll also be giving you a booklet that CMS has created that lays these out a little bit more cleanly. So as I said, an IDTF does have to comply with all state and federal licensure. And you need to keep in mind that those requirements, those certifications, that licensure could be different per state, and the MACs are not responsible for monitoring that. We're aware of it. We know what the licensure requirements are. We do know that. However, the individual IDTFs do need to be responsible for knowing what those regulations are for the states in which they're practicing or providing services and ensure that they're meeting those regulations. IDTFs do also need to maintain a physical address where they're providing services, especially if obviously if they're a fixed IDTF, and that has to be reported on the enrollment application, and it has to be an accurate address. The space needs to have adequate space and facilities for the services that are being provided, and this includes mobile units. The mobile unit itself has to have the appropriate physical space to perform the test. As far as a physical address with a mobile unit, it's going to be a base of operations versus necessarily a physical space that patients are coming to. So there's a slight difference. The other thing, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but an IDTF is only allowed one location per enrollment. So if there are multiple physical locations that need to be reported, that's something that's going to be reported on multiple CMS 855B applications. They also need to maintain a primary business phone number, and it needs to be under the name of the business listed on the application. It wouldn't be valid to be listed and have their primary business phone number listed under, say, a parent corporation. That's something that is not acceptable. The other thing to keep in mind is that call forwarding or answering services, while they can be used as a backup, they cannot be used as the primary phone number. It does need to be a phone number where patients or MACs or CMS can reach the IDTF directly. IDTFs are also one of the few providers that are required to hold a certain level of liability insurance. So IDTFs must hold liability insurance of at least $300,000 per location to cover both the place of business, so that facility, but it also has to cover all customers and employees. And that's the minimum. It doesn't have to be exactly 300,000, but it can't go below that threshold. If there's more, that's fine. And failure to hold this insurance will result in revocation of any Medicare billing privileges or the denial of the enrollment application. So that's something to keep in mind. And it is something that MACs can request proof of during the enrollment process. Remember earlier, I also mentioned that IDTFs are providing services for patients by referral and by that treating physician. So that also means that an IDTF does have to agree to not directly solicit patients. And that means they're not soliciting patients directly for services via phone, email, or in-person contact. Now, the IDTFs may have a situation where their supervising physician is the referring provider, and we'll talk about that, but that's typically if their supervising physician is also treating the beneficiary for their medical condition. They're going to also then have to maintain patient documentation, and we're looking for documentation on the patient's clinical complaint. So why are they being referred? Why are the tests occurring? So that's going to need to be made available upon request to either MACs or CMS. So they need to maintain that separate documentation versus just having it maintained at the referring provider's office. IDTFs are also going to have to post these standards, which is why I'm also giving you another reason I'm giving you the resources or the links in the resource section, because those standards do need to be published so that the general public and patients have access to view those standards, just so that they understand the standards that IDTF is being held to for CMS and Medicare purposes. As I said, the list is fairly involved, so we are going to continue on. There are some more standards that we do need to talk about. First, one of the other things is to maintain enrollment information. You're here today to learn about IDTF enrollment, but once you receive that enrollment, once you receive that provider transaction access number or PTAN number, that has to be maintained. And that could include changes of information. Maybe it's changes to correspondence address. Maybe it's changes to different ownership or managing control information, changes in phone numbers, changes in locations. But also every 5 years, IDTFs are included in the requirement to revalidate. And a revalidation is very much like an initial enrollment, but a new PTAN is not issued because we are reconfirming everything that we know that is currently on your file to make sure that we have all the current information. Some of the things that we see with revalidations that I want to point out to you with maintaining that enrollment information is that everything on one's enrollment file is not accounted for in the application. The application comes in and it really looks more like a change. It's pointing out the things that maybe need to be changed. For a revalidation, you need to ensure that you're really filling it out like an initial enrollment. You want to fill it out for everything that's current about that provider, but then you're also going to want to fill it out as you would a change information, removing anything that needs to be removed, adding any new information. So that's something to keep in mind with that maintenance of that enrollment information. And I mentioned ownership as one of the changes that can occur. This is one of the things that we see that sometimes that it's often developed on. It's definitely a top development reason in provider enrollment, but ownership. So we need to have all ownership and managing control disclosed on the enrollment application. If it is an initial, it has to include everything. If it's a revalidation, it has to include what the current should be and if there are any changes. And then if there are changes, that has to be reported typically in 30 calendar days. To ensure that our enrollment record is current. And that ownership and that managing control information includes both individuals that have ownership or managing control, but it also includes any organizations, whether that's a parent organization or perhaps there's just some type of business management organization. That all needs to be included on that application. Disclosure of ownership is one of the key pieces of fraud prevention with CMS and Medicare, and it's about not only vetting the enrolling provider, but those that have control over the funds to ensure that CMS knows who has access to those Medicare funds and that they're preventing those that would do harm to the Medicare Trust Fund from accessing those funds. Next, the next standard I want to talk about is testing and maintaining the equipment. So this really encompasses just making sure that the equipment is in working order and that it's calibrated according to manufacturer guidelines. And that supervising physician is really going to be a big part of ensuring that that is occurring. They may not be doing the calibrations themselves, but they are part of ensuring that that's happening. They also need to ensure as a standard that the technicians are qualified staff and they are on duty at the time of the tests. And this includes any state or federal certifications, making sure that they have them, making sure that they're up to date, making sure that any continuing education is occurring. And also with those technical staff, the certifications do need to be available. The licensure also needs to be available upon request as part of that enrollment process. I mentioned this one a little bit already about maintaining the documentation. Along with that, though, there does need to be proper medical record storage, and that record storage needs to allow for the provider to be able to provide medical records within 2 business days. So it has to be something that is available and can be accessed quickly. We'll talk about this next one a little bit more later, but IDTFs are required to undergo a site visit. And so one of their standards is to permit those site visits by either CMS, the MAC, or the site visit contractor. It's typically the site visit contractor, but they are going to need to allow those inspectors to access the facility. They may need to interact with staff as part of that enrollment process. It can happen in revalidation along with any location changes as well. And then the final standard that I want to talk about is going to be the requirement that they bill for services furnished, unless they're furnishing those services under arrangement. So if they're providing those diagnostic tests, that IDTF is going to be required to bill for those diagnostic tests. The arrangement scenario comes into play. Some examples include, say, a hospice situation or a skilled nursing facility where you have an arrangement with those facilities to perform those tests, but it's ultimately going to be included as part of that hospice or that skilled nursing facility billing. That would be the only exception to that billing for services furnished. So IDTFs are also subject to an enrollment fee when they enroll, and this enrollment fee would apply to any initial enrollment applications, revalidations, and new locations. Now, we don't see the new locations as much with IDTFs, and that's because they're reporting 1 location per enrollment, but it can happen. The fee for 2024 is $709. CMS does update this information towards the end of each year. If there's going to be a change, that will be posted on CMS's website, or it will be posted in PACOS or on the fee payment website, and I have links to both of those on this slide for you. And you're seeing an image on the right of what that's going to look like. It will lay out the scenarios where you'd be required to pay the fee, and it'll give you the year and the amount. Now, something that I want to be very clear if you're new to the enrollment fee, that enrollment fee is based on the calendar year that you're paying the fee. So as we get further into the year, we have a ways to go. It's only July, but it'll go fast as we get towards the end of the year. What we do see sometimes, particularly with revalidations, is that the enrollment fee will be paid in 1 year, so for instance 2024, but the application isn't submitted until 2025. That is something that is going to require development for the payment of the 2025 year fee if it's different from the 2024 fee. The 2024 enrollment fee would be refundable, but the enrollment fee does need to be paid in the submission year of the application. Before I check in with Aline for questions, I do want to mention again the site visit requirement. I mentioned that permitting site visits was one of the standards for an IDTF, and IDTFs do fall into the moderate risk level category per the Program Integrity Manual. And that just means that we have to perform a site visit for any practice locations and base of operations that are being reported on an application. And that impacts both initial applications and revalidations, and again, new locations. The results of those site visits do impact the enrollment decision. So if it's found that the location is not valid, the enrollment will not proceed. So it's something to keep in mind that this does have to happen as part of that enrollment process, and PTANs will not be assigned, revalidations will not be completed, and changes will not be completed until after that site visit is completed. Now, I do want to mention changes. If you're changing something like a correspondence address or there's some ownership, that's not going to precipitate the need for that site visit requirement. It is pretty specific to initial revalidation and new locations. However, CMS can deem the need for any provider if a site visit is needed to request that. Before I move forward, I just want to check in with Aline. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Leanne. We do not have any questions at this time. I did stick a little reminder in the chat that if you do have a question, just jot it down here and then we'll address it so that we can get answers for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Aline. Appreciate it. So we've covered the basics. Now we want to jump into what enrollment looks like for these providers. So first and foremost, an IDTF is going to complete a CMS 855B. They are a Part B supplier, so whether you're completing the application electronically or via paper, it is the CMS 855B questions and fields that are being completed. They will get one enrollment per location. I mentioned that already. That also means they'll get one PTAN per enrollment. And that location is really important, especially for your fixed IDTFs, because that's really where the fee schedules are coming from for reimbursement. So it's not all that uncommon for an IDTF that has, well, obviously it's not uncommon for an IDTF with multiple locations to have multiple enrollment records and multiple PTANs. Now, it is possible for them to use the same national provider identifier, that 10-digit identifier for each one of those enrollments, but the PTAN is really what houses that metadata, like I said, for reimbursement, for claims adjudication. It's going to include things such as the location, any vehicle information, any bank account information, contact information for that one. Now, as I mentioned, IDTFs are a Part B supplier, so they are also only going to get that one PTAN, and there will not be group members or reassignments, as you see typically with a medical group practice. However, that doesn't mean that the physicians may not need to fill out an 855I as if they were going to receive a reassignment. So there are instances if an IDTF is billing globally, so for the professional and the technical component, if they're having those interpreting physicians do need to be connected to that IDTF, and the way to do that is to complete that CMS 855I in that reassignment section so that we can connect it in our system so that when claims come through, we know that everything is as it should be. However, in this instance, if filling out that CMS 855I for an interpreting physician, a PTAN is not going to be issued. It's really about collecting information on the individual as they relate to the IDTF to connect them in our system. There are a couple of submission options. Providers can submit electronically through the Provider Enrollment Chain and Ownership System, or also known as PACOS, or the paper CMS 855B application. The same information is included in the electronic system in PACOS as it's requested on the CMS 855V. It's just going to look a little bit different, and it might be in a slightly different, it's typically in a slightly different order, but the system works very much like a do-it-yourself tax program. It's going to ask you questions, and it's going to provide you with the topics. That's kind of that is the equivalent to a section on a paper application, the topics that must be completed in order to execute the task for your provider type. So that's going to be there. I do encourage you, if you're not already, submitting applications electronically to do so. It is the most efficient. In fact, processing times are significantly different for an electronic application, provided no development is needed. The processing time, we for sure look at it. Ideally, the site visit can slow it down just a little bit, but we ideally can process those within 15 calendar days. With a paper application, it is going to typically be 30, and those are CMS standards for processing. It's a big difference, and the big difference is with electronic, we can take advantage of some automations. There's less data entry. There's some verifications that it can occur that streamline that process. The other advantage is when it comes time to make a change or revalidate your provider, you can see everything that we have on file for your provider and just make changes. A revalidation, if there are no changes to be made, you'll need to go through and confirm that you've reviewed all of the sections, sign it and submit it in. It goes quite quickly. With changes, you can see whether or not something needs to be changed, and you can submit that change. And typically, when you submit an electronic application, we can see it either that same day or the next day. Typically, it's the next day to ingest it into our workload system. With paper application, you're looking at a longer turnaround time because it needs to come through the mail, it needs to be opened, it needs to be ingested into our workload system before an analyst can see it. So again, it's just perfectly acceptable, but it just takes a little bit longer because it's paper. So the required sections for an IDTF, I'm showing you as we go through these sections, both the electronic version and the paper version. I'm not going to go through the entire 855B. I'm going to focus on the items that are a little bit unique or might be a little different for an IDTF, starting with the required sections piece of it. So on the left, you're looking at PACOS, and this is the application questionnaire. I mentioned that it works much like a do-it-yourself tax program where it's going to ask you questions. By selecting IDTF from that dropdown for a Part B supplier of services, it is going to know to attach what is referred to as attachment 2 to your topics listing. In fact, that is the only way to get attachment 2 to populate for you. So this is super important. If for some reason you were to select clinic group practice accidentally, when you get into that, you're not going to have attachment 2. And this is critical because you can't change that. If you were to select the incorrect specialty for an IDTF, in that scenario, the only course of action would be to delete the electronic application and start over. You could do it. It doesn't take that long. It's not that involved, but it could be a little frustrating. So it's just key that you're selecting that proper provider type so that the system knows exactly what sections that you need. On the right side, you are seeing this paper CMS 855B, and I apologize, I do have that green highlight on for ambulance. It should be down for IDTF suppliers and telling you to complete attachment 2. You would skip attachment 1, you would skip attachment 3. We just need attachment 2 in addition to sections 1 through 15. The next section where things are going to look a little bit different is going to be section 4A. So we need to know all of the practice locations, but as I mentioned before, an IDTF is only going to report one practice location per application. It's going to need its own enrollment record. It's going to need its own PTAN. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. On the right is how it would be reported in PACOS. On the left is how it would be reported on a paper application. And the one thing that's a little bit different here is that if you have a mobile IDTF, when you get to the practice physical location special payments address topic, you're going to be able to tell the system that it is either a practice location or base of operations. By selecting base of operations, you are telling PACOS that this is a mobile unit for an IDTF. With that, you get into sections 4E and 4F on the CMS 855B, which you're seeing on the right. 4E is where you would indicate that this is a base of operations for a mobile unit. There's not a checkbox for is this a mobile unit or is it a fixed IDTF? It's about the section that you complete. So by filling section 4E on a paper, you're telling the MAC that it is a mobile unit. With PACOS, you're going to be looking for the physical location special payments address, the vehicle information, and the geographic location topics. They are separate topics in PACOS, but in PACOS, as you're filling out topics, just start at the beginning. The system will take you to the next section as you progress through that application without you having to come back to topics and jump back in. So the information that it's asking for here, it's base of operations. Again, I mentioned we can only have the one base of operations. If you have multiple mobile units with different bases of operation, then that has to be reported on a separate application. It can be the same as the practice location. That's a little different with IDTFs. You do need to list that practice location, but you can also indicate that it is also the base of operations, and that's really what's going into the front end of that enrollment record. So it does need to be reported seemingly twice. The other thing we're going to ask for is going to be vehicle information when we have a mobile unit. So this is used for a mobile IDTF. You can add or remove vehicles here, and we would ask that that is, again, part of maintaining that enrollment. So if a vehicle is being decommissioned or a new vehicle is being put into service, we do need those reported. And you have to give us the date that that vehicle was providing services. As we get into attachment 2, we're going to start talking about procedure codes and the types of tests that are being provided by the IDTF, and it attaches to equipment and vehicles. So we need to know those dates. We are going to ask what type of vehicle. So that's going to be, is it a trailer? Is it a van? Is it a mobile home? Again, I mentioned those trucks going up and down the roads that have MRI scanner on those. That would be a trailer. And then we do need that vehicle identification number. This is going to be that or VIN. It's going to be that VIN that we all see on our own personal vehicles. It's going to be on the registration. We need that number. Depending on the vehicle, you might see it in the windshield, but that is the number that we're looking for. Super long number, and we're going to need that documentation to confirm that. We talked about this a little bit already as well, but ownership and managing control. So there are 2 sections for that in both the paper and the electronic format. Section 5 is for organizations. So think parent company, any type of primary governing body. We don't see that as often with an IDTF, but if they exist, they do need to be reported. A business management company. Those are examples of what would need to be reported in Section 6, whether they have ownership or simply managing control of the IDTF. They all need to be reported. Section 6 is for individuals, and really the differences in the sections is about, I'm asking for a first name and a date of birth and a social security number versus a legal business name and a tax ID. But very much the sections are very similar in that we need to know information about those that are going to have access to Medicare funds. Section 6, as I said, is for owners and managing employees, but also authorized and delegated officials. So these are going to be the individuals that can sign your application. That authorized official is going to be the person that can legally bind the IDTF into a contract and hold them accountable for complying with all Medicare rules and regulations, also known as those standards. A delegated official is going to have signature rights, and they cannot sign for an initial enrollment. An AO can, but a delegated official can sign for any changes or revalidations that come up as part of maintaining that enrollment. So next we're going to move into attachment 2, and this is really where things get different for an IDTF versus other suppliers with Medicare. So attachment 2 is where the IDTF is going to need to report all CPT and HCPCS codes for the diagnostic services that they provide. And we are looking for all of them. And you only have a slot for 13 here. This is a section on a paper application we typically will see copied and completed multiple times, and this can get quite lengthy. This is another area where Submitting electronically is an advantage. You can just continue to click on add information to add more codes. And the information we're looking for is going to be the obviously the CPT or the HCPCS code, any modifier that you intend on using it, so technical or professional component. We also want to know which piece of equipment and the model number for the equipment that will be used to perform that test. So if you're performing a CPT code or a procedure on multiple pieces of equipment, that CPT or HCPCS code will be listed multiple times. And you want to use one line per code per piece of equipment. There's not a lot of space. You're not going to want to squinch the different equipment and the model number. This is used during that site visit. They do look at this, so that has to be there. One thing you're going to notice is that it's also going to include services you're performing, as I mentioned, but it also needs to include any services that are supervised or interpreted. So anything that's happening there. The next page of attachment 2 is for interpreting physicians. So an interpreting physician is somebody who's reading that test or looking at those results. If the interpretations are being billed by that IDTF, we need those interpreting physicians. I mentioned earlier that interpreting physicians, they're not required for all IDTFs. It's simply if you're going to be billing globally and you have them, they do need to be reported and potentially need that 855I that submitted, because they are going to need to be vetted through Medicare. They have to be licensed in the state in which those interpretations are going to be provided. They have to be qualified to perform the tests that they're interpreting, and they have to we have to ensure that they're not excluded from the Medicare program. So they essentially have to be a Medicare eligible provider, and that's part of that reason for that CMS 855I. The next page will include or will ask for information regarding the personnel or those technicians. We do need to have all technicians reported. Again, with the paper, you may have to copy and complete that section multiple times to report all technicians for this site. And then in PACOS, you can just continue to add that information. But those technicians have to meet certification and licensure requirements in the state where the services are performed, and they have to be qualified to perform those tests. And we're also going to need licenses and certificates available upon request during that enrollment process. So you just have to ensure that that's there. We are going to ask for their name, their social security number, and their date of birth. And then we are asking, are they licensed? Are they certified? With the license and the certifications, they might be both. They might be one or the other. So just make sure you're reporting all pertinent information. Next, we have supervising physicians. So a supervising physician does have to be licensed again to practice in the state where they're providing that supervision, and they cannot be excluded from the Medicare program in any way. So they have to be a provider who's eligible to enroll and bill in Medicare. All IDTFs are going to be required to have a minimum of one supervising physician. They can have multiple. Sometimes it varies based on the type of supervision that they're providing, which we'll talk about next. The supervising physician does have to be enrolled in Medicare, so we're going to be looking for their PTAN. They're also going to be asked to list other facilities that they're providing supervision at. A supervising physician can provide supervision at more than one IDTF facility. However, if they are providing general supervision, there is a limit. So that limit is 3 sites, and that is whether it's fixed or mobile. Okay, so that's just a limitation because general supervision is fairly involved, and so it's a matter of how are they divvying up that time. What you're also seeing on your screen, the definitions are in the application section. So you do have the paper sections, but on the PACO section, I've highlighted it with the orange yellow box, depending on your screen, but it does show the definitions for the different levels of supervision, which we're going to look at next. So the first level of supervision is personal supervision, and this means that that provider is going to be in attendance and physically in the room during that procedure. They are going to be there observing, supervising it, and their attention is not otherwise divided. With direct supervision, the provider will be in the office, they'll be in the building. They don't necessarily have to be in the room while the procedure is happening, the room with the patient while that procedure is happening, but they do need to be immediately available during that procedure. And then general supervision, that is going to be the overall direction and control. So I mentioned earlier that supervising physicians may have that responsibility to ensure that the technicians are trained, that the machines are getting calibrated, and that is going to be that general supervision. And that's a pretty big undertaking because, again, you're responsible for that equipment. They don't necessarily have to be present during the procedures because, again, it's general supervision and they're overseeing the entire IDTF and not necessarily just the procedures. But that has to be identified in attachment 2. PACOS, it's going to be laid out similarly, but it's going to ask you these questions independently. So I just didn't put that on that slide, but you're going to indicate that. And then they have to indicate what functions they assume responsibility for. You'll see these 3 check boxes right here. And it's just asking about that level of supervision, confirming that level of supervision, and then what other sites are they providing that supervision so that we can ensure that adequate supervision is being provided for that IDTF during that enrollment process. The supervising physician does also have to sign the application. They do need to sign the attestation, and they have to acknowledge that they are providing, and it's going to ask you to fill in the name of the IDTF. On PACOS, this is going to be part of that general signature section where your authorized and delegated official would sign. You'll also have to do this attestation. And they're then going to have to indicate the information for what services they are providing supervision for and sign and date it. And again, this is a section that if you're doing it on paper may have to be copied and completed multiple times. So again, just kind of another reason to advocate for electronic if you're not doing so already. So before we check in again for questions, I want to talk about the documentation. So things that you may be asked to provide during the enrollment process. Lease or bill of sale for the equipment. Again, that's usually that's used to confirm the model numbers and the pieces of equipment, making sure that they're there. You may be asked for all applicable licenses and certifications for the supervising physician, the interpreting physician, and the technicians. We are going to need federal IRS tax documentation because that's also going to help us verify the legal business name of the enrolling provider. So it does need to be something that is created by the federal IRS and is going to have the legal name and the tax ID on it. It can't be a handwritten letter. It can't be a typed letter unless that letter is coming from the IRS. So examples would include a 147C. If the IDTF is nonprofit, their statement, their 501c3, things of that nature. CP 575. We're going to be looking for a copy of that liability insurance. Remember, IDTFs have to maintain a minimum level of $300,000 of comprehensive liability insurance. So we are looking for that. It can be more, but it can't fall below that $300,000 threshold. IDTF is going to be paid electronically, just like any other provider. So they will be asked to provide that CMS 588 electronic funds transfer form on an initial enrollment. Changes only if the banking information is changing, whether it is the account or the account holder, the bank itself, and revalidations are the same. If the provider is already set up for electronic funds transfer, which they would be if they're already enrolled, they don't have to submit a new EFT with a revalidation unless that banking information is changing. And then if they wish to be participating, they would submit that CMS 460 participation agreement. And here you're just looking at those resources that I have mentioned a couple of times. So there is the Program Integrity Manual, so Chapter 10, that is Section 10.2.2.4, that provides all of the enrollment information for IDTFs along with outlining those standards. I have also included a link to application fee information so that you have that. We talked about the Code of Federal Regulations that also includes those standards. And then that independent diagnostic testing facility, that fourth bullet, that is that booklet that CMS has that goes through enrollment, it goes through the standards, but it also includes some information on some billing issues that we see commonly with IDTF. So that's worth taking a look at. Also on our WPSGHA website, we do have a resource available to you that does talk about IDTF enrollment requirements so that you have that information. Okay, so I am going to check in with Aline one more time. Do we have any questions in the chat?
And we don't have any questions that relate to today's topic, so you are good to go.
All right, well, I thank you very much. A couple of things before we go. I do want to make you aware of some exciting opportunities that CMS has coming up for you. First is the National Provider Enrollment Conference. They are holding an in-person conference this year in San Diego, California, and they are holding it on August 28th and August 29th. This is going to be an excellent opportunity to interact with CMS. WPS will have provider enrollment representatives there as well, so you can interact with your MAC, ask questions. There's also going to be multiple sessions from Provider Enrollment 101 to sessions about upcoming regulatory changes, either proposed or final. So it's a really good opportunity. The other thing is that this conference is free to attend. There is no cost to enter the conference. You would be on your own for travel and lodging, but again, it's free to enter the conference, and I've included the link to the agenda and registration if you'd like to take a look at that. Also, in the beginning of August, there is a National Provider Compliance Conference. This one is virtual, so you would be able to attend from your office or home. This is going to be held on August 7th and August 8th from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern each day. And this is, again, a compliance conference. So if you or someone you know is a compliance professional, this will be an interesting thing to check out. And I've included the agenda and the registration there as well. And just a reminder, this one is virtual, so it might be a little more flexible for you. So one more time before we go, Aline, do we have any questions in the chat?
We did get one question, Leanne, and it says, can an AO digitally, electronically sign documents like the EFT when returning by request from APS?
So if you are returning, if there's been a request from provider enrollment, if you're sending that EFT back in through PACOS, the EFT signature is part of the electronic signature process in PACOS. So they absolutely can sign those requests and send those electronically.
Perfect, and that was the only question that we got.
All right, thank you. So with that, that ends our presentation for today. On behalf of Aline, myself, and the entire WPSGHA Provider Outreach and Education team, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. I hope this was beneficial to you, and we look forward to those survey comments. Again, please make sure that you are including any topic ideas of education you'd like to see in the future. Again, thank you very much. I hope you are well. You may now disconnect.